We hear this a lot. Talk about the culture war becoming the Civil War, the end of the American Empire. How many times in my life have I heard that empires typically only last 200 years? Basically all the time. Whenever there's some kind of kerfluffle, whenever there's some kind of political turmoil, people remind me. And I'm sure you hear the same thing. You know, empires only last 200 years. We're well above that. Well, Vox is the latest to hop on this story. And they did an interview with someone talking about this, so there's some interesting points that are worth bringing up in the parallels between the fall of Rome and the American Empire. This is from Vox. What America can learn from the fall of the Roman Republic. The Roman Republic destroyed itself. Are we on a similar path? If you were a Roman citizen around, say, 200 BC, you probably would have assumed Rome was going to last forever. At the time, Rome was the greatest republic in human history, and its institutions had proven resilient through invasions and all kinds of disasters. But the foundations of Rome started to weaken less than a century later, and by 27 BC, the Republic had collapsed entirely. The story of Rome's fall is both complicated and relatively straightforward. The state became too big and chaotic. The influence of money and private interests corrupted public institutions, and social and economic inequalities became so large that citizens lost faith in the system altogether and gradually fell into the arms of tyrants and demagogues. It's a good point, a good time to point out something I've said before, where I'm like, I would rather vote for Bernie Sanders, who would do something like spend a ton of tax money for giving student loans, than ignore the problem and wait until we're just in a full-blown socialist state. Admittedly, it's a slippery slope argument. You vote for Bernie, maybe you get to that path. But I will say, our society directed young people towards college in massive debt, and now they're desperate for a solution, so they're turning to socialists. I think our society screwed up through it wasn't a conspiracy, it's just this is how things moved, and we need to figure out how to solve that, alleviate that pressure, otherwise these young people are going to vote in every single socialist you can think of. Maybe, yeah, I don't know, but we'll carry on. I don't want to get on that. We'll talk about the fall of Rome instead. If all that sounds familiar, well, that's because the parallels to our current political moment are striking. Edward Watts, a historian at the University of California, San Diego, has just published a new book titled Mortal Republic that carefully lays out what went wrong in ancient Rome and how the lessons of its decline might help save fledgling republics like the United States today. I believe the U.S. is older than Rome was. I could be wrong, but we're fledgling? I mean, what? How old are we? 230-something, 240 years? 242, is that where we're at? I spoke to Watts about those lessons and why he thinks the American Republic, along with several others, are in danger of going the way of ancient Rome. A lightly edited transcript of our conversation follows. So I'm going to ignore what the guy Sean Illing said and we'll just read some of what Edward Watts had to say about this. He said, when I started teaching Roman history, the main questions from students were always about comparing the end of the Roman Empire with the state of the American Empire, and this was usually tied to the Iraq War. In the past 10 years, these sorts of questions have died down. Now students are interested in Rome as a republic and whether the American Republic is collapsing in the same way. They see lots of parallels there, especially in how the two systems are structured. He said, first, we have to remember that the U.S. is a representative democracy. We tend to drop the representative part when we're talking about what political system we live under. But that's actually quite important. This is not a direct democracy, and Rome was not a direct democracy either. What you have in both cases is a system where people are chosen by the voters to make decisions, and then there's a period of time when they make those decisions, and then they're held accountable for how those decisions turned out. But the representatives are making the choices, and people have noticed that that works fine until those representatives either stop making principled decisions or become paralyzed by the vicissitudes of popular opinion. Both of those things started to happen when Rome began to decline, and both of those things are happening in the U.S. right now. They could have recognized what their system was designed to do, which was produce compromise and consensus. Ultimately, it's better to make no decision than to make a bad decision. What Romans failed to appreciate was that their processes were slow and deliberative for very good reasons. That's how representative systems avoid disaster, how you get people to the table to work out compromise. For 300 years, this system worked quite well for Rome. Okay, so I think we're younger than Rome. But for the past century or so of its existence, these tools of deliberation were used not to facilitate compromise, but to obstruct and punish political enemies and basically prevent anything from happening. That destroyed the goodwill within the system and really poisoned it in the minds of the voters. So now we have Vox. They want to shoehorn in the Donald Trump's thing. He said, Sean, the writer says, shortly after Trump's election, I wrote about Plato's warning about the decline of democracy. Basically, he believed that democracies fall into tyranny when too much freedom leads to disorder and citizens choose the stability of autocracy over the chaos of democracy. This is what happened in Rome. Do you believe the same thing is happening right now? Yes. He says, I think that we're in the early stages of a process that could lead to that. The point at which Romans were willing to make that trade occurred almost after 150 years of political dysfunction. But it also occurred after a generation of really brutal civil war. And the process that started that was one of economic inequality and the inability and unwillingness of the people vested in the upper successful parts of the Roman state to address that economic inequality. I'll make my predictions based off this. I think what we're going to see is the culture war is increasingly becoming the privileged white people and the privileged in general, because I kid you not, there was an article called Black Men Are the White Men. Okay, it was called like Black Men Are the White People of Black People. I kid you not, that's a real article, something like that. Basically, what I think we're going to see is not so much about economic inequality, because the conversation has shifted to privilege inequality, and we're going to see the Civil War butt off into, like, the culture war will become something like that. We may very well be in the next Civil War, and we wouldn't know it. Because when people look back in history, they condense everything. So maybe in 100 years they go, wow, it was the election of Donald Trump that started the culture war. It was Gamergate that started the Civil War. And for all we know, we're living in it. We've seen street violence, right? We've seen Antifa beating people. We've seen, Proud Boys and Antifa fighting in the streets. We've already seen more extreme. I'm not trying to call either group the most extreme. I don't want to get into that debate. The point is, there are two factions which hold particularly more extreme views than the average person. You've got Antifa, believing everyone's a Nazi, and you have the Proud Boys, defenders of Western chauvinism and like Western tradition. And those views are way more polarized than the average person, and then they fight in the streets. You want to get into debate over who's starting it most of the time? I think it's typically Antifa, but by all means comment below if you want to dispute anything of what I'm saying. The point I'm trying to make is not to condemn or condone, but simply that the street battles are happening. And that means it may come a time where we're like, how did they not know that it already started when people were fighting in the streets? We had economic collapse. Look at the stock market over the past couple weeks. It's been up and down like crazy. It goes up and then it collapses, and then with the biggest gain in history. That to me sounds like death throes, right? So I don't want to be alarmist, but I do think it's fair to say when you look at the parallels from history, you learn from the past or you're doomed to repeat it. But let's carry on. He says, as people's needs were not being addressed for decades, the tensions heightened to the point where violence started breaking out. Well, we saw violence break out. And once violence starts to break out, it's very difficult for a republic to regain control of itself. It's easy to see how the U.S. and other established republics could be in the beginning states of a similar process. I don't think we're quite there. I don't think we're there quite yet, but there are reasons for genuine concern. Now let's walk things back a little bit, because I want to point something else. There's a big difference in that we have the massive surveillance state and communication technology. It was easy for a republic to collapse because communication took too long. And eventually groups would form and say, you know what, we don't recognize you anywhere. We haven't heard from you in a long enough time. You collapsed. Now, communication is instant. I film these videos and just press, I do the edit and then I upload it right away. And within minutes, people can hear my thoughts on issues and learn news. Right? It probably took days, weeks, or months for organizing in that era. If something happened where the economy did get really, really bad, it would not be hard for the U.S. executive branch to coordinate with the rest of its resources. So I think it would be easy for them to maintain power. The other issue is that with a surveillance state, it's really easy to disrupt anything that might cause the collapse. So when they start hearing about Antifa getting particularly extreme, I'll put it this way. One of the reasons you likely don't see Antifa banned is because law enforcement doesn't want them banned. They want to know what these people are talking about. There's no such thing for the Proud Boys. The Proud Boys were not labeled as an extremist group by the FBI. That was essentially just hearsay and conjecture. And it would seem like, although they are concerned about the escalation of violence, they don't really care about the Proud Boys that much. What ends up happening? There's no desire to say anything about them. The platforms just get rid of them. They don't like them. Antifa may be protected. I kid you not. I'm not saying they are, because they do get banned, certainly. We saw them banned from PayPal and from Twitter, for sure. The point is, often, you do hear about circumstances where the feds will be like, we want you to keep this up and running. Here's like a security letter, because we want to see what they're organizing. We want to hear what they have to say. That surveillance state is going to make it a lot harder for disruptive forces to try and destabilize what's going on. So, I could read through all of this, but let's just read the ultimate conclusion from Watts. He says, I'm extremely worried, but I still believe our decline is reversible. I trust that enough people recognize that it's better to have a dysfunctional republic than to have nothing at all. And in Rome, you do have these moments of retrenchment, where people step back and say, this is quite bad, this is too much, we have to pull back. But it's up to Americans, just like it was up to voters in Rome, to defend our institutions and to punish people who are misusing the tools that are supposed to make it strong, to instead undermine it. No one else will do it on their behalf. So I think it's by no means a foregone conclusion. History doesn't work that way. And there have been moments where the US looked to be in grave trouble and managed to bounce back. But we have to be really vigilant and defend the integrity of the Republic and defend the integrity of our system and punish those who abuse our institutions and violate our norms. And let me just add, protect the Constitution. Because there's a reason we have one. And we can see the effects of the Constitution, the protections that it grants us, by looking at other countries. And as they quickly decline into chaos, we have a solid document defending us. Plain and simple. Free speech being the most important. Because when people start getting arrested for jokes, for lyrics in the UK, confidence will be lost in the system, that the guilty will be punished and the innocent will be protected. In the US, the protection of free speech affords us more confidence in that system, and it may help us survive in the long run. I'm a big fan of the Constitution. I'm also a big fan of the fact that it can be amended. It shows that we're not so rigid that we can't change when we have to, but we do have an underlying document to protect ourselves from anyone who would usurp our institutions to dismantle us. Thanks for hanging out, and I will see you all tomorrow at 4 p.m.